Hi, everybody. My name is Nanika Edwards, and I am a poet, author, artist, educator, a number of different things from Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. In this series of videos, I am sharing portions of who I am with you, my followers and listeners, by letting you know some of the rules that I've bent or broken. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I realize sometimes people are very curious about me. To be honest, sometimes in a kind of creepy way, to be honest, in a kind of intrusive way. But when I say intrusive, intrusive from a distance. So voyeurism, I'm afraid to say, is has become, I think, a staple reality of my life. In one way or another, unfortunately. But I just thought that, wow, if people are that curious, maybe I should respond to that curiosity. Because my kind of concern, or the thing that kind of bothers me, is that because people don't because people don't feel they can approach me and ask me questions about myself. I mean, respectful questions, questions that leave my dignity intact, because just because I'm different doesn't mean I'm not human. I'm human. I have flesh and blood just like everybody else. As I say in one of the proverbs that I've come up with, I may not think the way that you think, but I do feel the way you feel. I still have the same feelings coursing through my emotional veins, right? So there's that. I just would like to I'd like to answer whatever question marks people have kind of floating above their heads about me. I'd also like to help people understand people like me, who understand people like myself who are gifted in some way or another. I have to admit, I don't always like saying that, but I guess that's the reality. I am gifted. And I mean, me being gifted, that's a whole long story. How that came about, blah, blah, blah. That's a whole long story, right? But I would like people to know that I'm human. I like people to have an understanding of how I think, how I reason. I'd also like to invite curiosity, invite proximity. I like people to know that it's okay to ask me questions. I'm not a monster. I'm not a beast. I'm not a monster. I'm not a beast. I'm not the beast of Beauty and the Beast, the female version, I guess, probably. I'm really quite harmless. I wish people knew that, but I think maybe the way that I speak, the way that I express myself and so on makes people feel that I may be aloof. But I think people who know me would tell you I'm not aloof. Not most times, unless there's something about you that's putting me off. I'm very friendly and approachable. And I remember not too long ago, when was it? Today is the 16th of March, 2026, but near the end of 2025, this was New Year's Day. I was hanging out with one of my cousins, and, well, my second cousin, daughter of one of my cousins, and she asked me a question about myself, something that I think most people would consider a pretty sensitive question to ask, but I wasn't offended, and I was happy to answer, because I realized that there are a lot of questions swirling about some things about me, and I liked putting that baby to bed. I liked putting that baby to rest. I like putting that misunderstanding to rest. And I don't always have the opportunity to do that. Why? Because people don't ask me questions. If people don't ask, I won't answer. If people don't ask, I would not impose my answer on anybody. I would not impose a response. So I was actually quite happy that she asked, and she actually commented and said, "Wow." She basically said, I would not have expected you to answer that question, but I had no problem answering the question. Anyway, because I'm not really. There aren't that many things that I'm really uptight about. I understand that we're humans. We're humans. We don't always have it all together. And we don't always have picture perfect lives. So if somebody asks me about something that's not picture perfect about my life, I have no problem answering, because I'm not hung up on that. Anyway, in this video, one of the things that I wanted to share was I wanted to share a rule that I've broken, or a rule that I've bent and flexed, I would say spiritually speaking, from a spiritual perspective, with spiritual strategy or spiritual chessboarding, if I could put it like that. And that rule is around money. Now, I have to say, I am not yet the entrepreneur that I would like to be. I'm still learning a lot of the ropes, and it's been many, many years, but I'm committed to the process, right? For me, building a business is like building an ark, like Noah building an ark. So I'm committed. So I'm committed to the process, even if it's for the long haul. But anyway, one of the rules that I've bent is actually around money. So sometimes here in Trinidad and Tobago, especially Trinidad, I have to say, but I don't think Tobago would be too different. When I tell people that, I studied in Canada, I lived in the Far East, in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Japan, when people then learn also that I went to a particular school, or, what would be called a prestige school in Trinidad, or if they learn that I speak a couple different languages, they automatically assume. And also when they learn about what my dad did for a living and that kind of thing, when people hear those things, they automatically assume that I grew up with a silver spoon in my mouth and that I have achieved all these things because I had an unfair advantage in life. And it's a very difficult thing to deal with here in Trinidad, because when people are like that, they become very obstructionist. It's hard to get things done sometimes, and it can just become a problem. People think it's okay to undercut you. All kinds of things come prepackaged with that here in this culture. But if people really understood my background, which they never take the time to be curious enough to ask me a proper question about, they would know that I actually, in a lot of ways, grew up with a wooden spoon in my mouth. I would say a wooden spoon. A wooden spoon, not a silver spoon, and definitely not a gold spoon. Maybe a wooden spoon. They probably think I had a champagne life. No, I had a mobby life. I had a mobby life in a lot of ways. Maybe not entirely, but in a lot of ways, I had a mobby life. I've had a mobby life. And I would say I still have a mobby life, right? Anyway, mobby, by the way, for those who are not from Trinidad and Tobago, mobby is a drink that's made from the bark of trees. I don't know if it's a particular tree. I don't know if there's a mobby tree. I think that somebody told me there's a mobby tree. But anyway, it's made from tree bark. And it's considered like, I guess you could say the poor man's drink in a sense, in some ways, right? But it's a very popular drink. Anyway, for many reasons, I grew up, I think, kind of having a mobby life on different levels. I won't go into that right now. But needless to say, what allowed me to travel, what allowed me to study, were things that actually a lot of times had nothing to do with money. For example, I studied in Canada. By the way, I was born in Canada. Here's the other thing. Trinis get angry if I tell them I was born in Canada. What, you think I jumped out of my mother's womb before I was conceived and told my parents I was to be born in Canada? Do you see how foolish and futile that kind of thinking is? I did not tell my parents where I was to be born, and so what if I was born in Canada? I don't think that makes me better than you. But a lot of Trinis think that I probably think that I'm better than them. But it has nothing to do with me. It has everything to do with how they think about themselves. But that has nothing to do with me. I don't even think about them in those terms that I am better than them or anything like that. So anyway, I was born in Canada. I studied in Canada. Because I guess if I had to choose between the United States and Canada at the time, Canada made more sense, because I was born in Canada, and as a Canadian, the fees were going to be cheaper. Anyway, long story short, I won a partial scholarship to McGill in Montreal. Now, for you people for people who feel that that was an unfair advantage, no, it wasn't. When I was in high school, I worked very hard. I was a diligent student. I did my homework. I didn't play the fool. I was very involved in sports. I was not a difficult student. I was, basically well-behaved student, minded my business kind of thing, put my head down, did my work. You help people if you could help them, where you could help them kind of thing. That's the kind of student I was. So I was an all-rounded student. That has nothing to do with money. That simply has to do with the choices you make as an individual. I worked very hard. I worked very, very hard. And so thankfully, I won a partial scholarship to do my undergrad studies. And then when I was in my final year at McGill, I did 3 years at McGill. In my final year, I won a scholarship to Taiwan. This time it was, yeah, you could say a partial scholarship, but because it did not cover accommodation, right? It was just to cover my tuition. Now, hear what? The scholarship covered airfare and my school fees, maybe with a little bit left over, right? But here's what happened. Before I went to Taiwan, I met a couple from Hong Kong. They put me on to somebody in Taiwan who let me sleep at their place while they were not there. My first night in Taiwan. And by the way, I wouldn't do those crazy, crazy things today. I think that was a crazy thing to do, right? I had no idea who those people were. They could have been anybody. Anyway, God was with me. And long story short, I ended up staying at a church dorm for the whole time that I was in Taiwan. And they did not charge the same kind of, they did not charge for accommodation. Let's put it like this. What I paid for accommodation living with the church dorm was much cheaper than what I would have paid if I had to look for accommodation outside of that church dorm. And what opened the door for me to live in that church dorm was, one, I was a believer. Two, during the first 2 weeks that I was at the church dorm, they were carefully monitoring me, unbeknownst to me. And they realized I wasn't a partier, I wasn't a drinker, I was not a reveler, I wasn't a party animal, I wasn't going to tear up the place or cause trouble. So they told me I could stay the whole time, By staying at that dorm, I paid about, my math is very bad, but I paid about, maybe, what would that be? A fifth or about a fifth or a third? I'm not too sure of what I would have ordinarily paid. So let me give you the figures. That dorm, I paid $2,000 a month to stay at that dorm. And eventually I think they raised it to $3,000 a month. That's not US dollars, that's NT. So I think it would have been maybe 200 to 300 US a month. I think that's what it would have been. Something like that. I can't remember. I can't remember what the exchange rate was. But if I had to look for a place outside on my own, it would have been $10,000 maybe to $15,000 a month that I would have had to be paying. So you see what happened there. And by the way, my scholarship was, I think, 10,000 a month, 10,000 NT, 10,000, 10,000 NT. I think that's what the Taiwanese dollar is called, the NT. So I was getting a scholarship. I think my scholarship was 10,000. So you see how that fully covered everything. My parents didn't have to pay a cent for me to be in Taiwan. God was so good to me. Okay. Then I come back home. I'm here for a little while. Tra-la-la, TTT. I ain't doing no big job. Nobody's interested in Chinese, right? I work in a hotel as a front desk clerk. They gave us a fancy name. They called us guest service agents. But we were front desk clerks, right? I did simple jobs. I taught English for a while. And then I went to Korea. Long story short, God opened the way for me to go to Korea. And long story short, I applied to go to Korea. I was turned down initially. However, I felt that God really wanted me to be in Korea. So I prayed. I prayed. No. Sorry. I prayed. And when I prayed, God put an image in my mind. I saw a top. I saw a top head. You know those tops, Trinis, my fellow Trinis that you would see on the side of a building or in the street or something? A top with the kind of bronze finish and, you swivel the head kind of thing. That's the tap that I saw, and as it turned, I saw it turn and I knew it turned, and as it turned, I just saw water gushing out. Initially, I saw a tap head that was dry. There was no water coming out of it. It turned, and then water was just gushing out. And I prayed along those lines, and then I made a call to the person who was kind of like the go-between between myself and the scholarship organization in Korea, which was really ultimately, I think, the Korean government, but a go-between. There was a go-between between myself and the Korean government from the embassy of Korea in Ottawa. I spoke with that person, and long story short, that was the turning point. That conversation opened the way for me to be able to go to Korea. Now, when I was in Korea, my plan was to spend the first semester at the accommodation on campus, and then hold on, just now. Sorry, I'm getting it wrong. My father agreed. Now, by the way, bear in mind, all this time I'm really helping my parents because I'm winning scholarships and so on, right? In fact, when I was at McGill, I got an additional partial scholarship based on the results of my exams and so on, right? So, all right. So I'm in Korea, and my father agreed to pay for the first semester. In terms of the accommodation, the scholarship covered my tuition fees, but it did not cover accommodation. So my father agreed to pay for my first semester of accommodation, and he said after that I would be on my own. I said, no problem, I'll work. I have no problem working. Okay, so here's what happened. I landed in Korea, and about, a couple weeks, a month, it couldn't be a couple months, maybe about a couple weeks, a week, to about a month later, the Korean government issued a law, and they said if you're a foreigner studying in Korea, you cannot work, you cannot study and make money at the same time. So I was in a real dilemma here, right? Because my plan was to work, right? My plan was to work and pay my way through. Here's how it ended up working out. Long story short, I stood on the fact that I knew that God wanted me to be in Korea. I knew that God wanted me there. So I prayed, I walked with God, I processed everything with God. I just kept declaring that God was in it. He would make a way, blah, blah, blah. I had no idea what God was going to do. Long story short, this is going to have to be a long story for another day, because this is already longer than I meant it to be. Long story short, what God did was he worked things out in such a way that I ended up living with 5 different Korean families. And let me tell you, in a place like Korea, that is amazing. That is massively miraculous, because Korea, because of its history, understandably, and I say this from a compassionate place, because of their history, they're very xenophobic. They don't trust foreigners. So for me, as a foreigner, and let me add to that, as a black foreigner, as a black woman, it is massively miraculous that God so worked things out that I lived with 5 Korean families and had wonderful experiences with them. They all welcomed me with open arms. I was warmly received. I had a wonderful time. Now, how did that work? Guess what? I did work, I worked. I did work for them. They allowed me to live with them. So it wasn't totally, it wasn't absolutely philanthropic. They allowed me to live with them as long as I taught them English, which I did, because I had in the run up to going to Korea, I had been teaching English to Venezuelans. So I knew a thing or two about English, about teaching English as a second language. So I taught them English, and in return, they gave me room and board. So guess what? I didn't break any rules. I didn't break any laws, because no money exchanged hands. There was no exchange of services for money, right? So it was fine. It was fine. In fact, my scholarship organization was very helpful in this regard. So that's how God worked it out. No money. I had no money. When I was in Trinidad working, teaching English as a second language. I promise you I was not making big money. Okay? So long story short, I give those examples to say that I've been able to, I wouldn't say travel the world. There's a lot of the world I have not seen yet, but I have been able to travel to the Far East, live in the Far East. I've, to all extents and purposes, had a good education. But let me tell you, that's not because I was born with a silver spoon in my mouth, or because I had deep pockets, or because of any kind of parental spoiled child, anything. It's because I worked hard, I was a diligent student. Most importantly, I walked in faith and I believed God to do the impossible. I read the Word of God. I learned about the God who opened up the Red Sea, that liquid dead end, that watery dead end. He opened up that Red Sea and made a way for his people to walk through to the other side, to their promised land. I took things like that literally, you know. I take things like that literally and I say, God, if you could do that then, you can do that now, you know. You're the same God then that you are now. And because I walked in faith, you know, as the Bible says, God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. And for most of my life, I've been diligently seeking God. And these are just some of the, I guess, some of the side benefits, if I could put it like that, some of the side benefits that come with walking with God. I mean, that's not ultimately why I follow him. I follow him because he's a magnetizing person, because God has, his saving grace has turned up in my life on so many levels, and of course ultimately in Jesus dying on the cross for me. So anyway, this video is, funnily enough, the longest one I've done so far in this series to date. But you can have no money and God can take you across the world. You can have no money and God can open doors for you that no man can open and no man can shut. That's the kind of God that I serve, you know. And so if you find yourself in a place where, gosh, I don't have this, I don't have that, guess what? When Jesus fed the 5,000, he didn't ask anybody what they did not have. He asked them what they had. In my case, I had diligence, I had discipline, I had God-given intelligence. And even if you don't have even if you don't have massive intelligence and you want to get a scholarship, work hard, study, put strategies in place to really master the material. A lot of times, understanding academic material has very little to do with the intelligence of a student and a lot more to do with how the material is taught, you know? So, yeah, in my case, I had my diligence, I had my discipline, I had my intelligence. I was athletic, I was active in school. I wasn't only on academics, I did other things. I was diligent in school, outside of school, on top of which I had to maneuver through all of that while my family was falling apart. I mean, I think God was just so happy with how I was living life that he said, you know what, I'm gonna really bless this one in a special way. So even for my fellow brothers and sisters in the faith who look at me and they're like, how come Nika, how come God is always blessing Nika? I mean, that cannot be fair. Well, these are some of the reasons why, you know, and he would do that with anybody. I'm not a special case. God is not prejudiced. He's not biased. It's just that I studied him. I figured out what he liked, and I aim to please my God because I believe we're supposed to do that. It's as simple as that. So that's it. That's a rule that I bent, the money rule. The money rule that says if you have no money, you can't do nothing. If you have no money, you have no value. If you have no money, well, crapo, smoke your pipe, as we say in Trinidad. No, that didn't happen in my case. And throughout my life, I have to say, I think I found myself in positions where I've had to depend on God, and he's constantly shown that he will constantly come through. He's just that kind of God. And I'm really, really grateful. I'm really, really grateful. So, you know, you can think even of Ruth in the Bible when she was in Israel. You know, she came back with Naomi. They didn't have much. But look how God worked that out, right? Look how God worked that out. God is that kind of God. So I say that to anybody, you want to get things done. I don't know, you want to pursue studies, you want to build a business, you need to get a house, you need to get a car, you need a job, whatever it is. I encourage you, trust God. Place all your chips on Jesus Christ and he will work it out. I would just say, just make sure you don't see God as a sugar daddy, because that's insulting to God. He's not a sugar daddy. He's your papa God who loves you. And he doesn't want you to see him as a like a vending machine. He's not your sugar daddy. And I don't see him as a sugar daddy, but he's been a very I have to say, he's been a sugar daddy to me in the sense that he's been so sweet and he's my papa. And in that way he's like a sugar daddy, but I don't see him as a sugar daddy. He's a loving God, he's a loving, loving, kind God. And so anyway, this is how I was able to bend the rule that says if no money, no love, no money, no opportunity, no money, you can't do anything, no money, no money. So, in other words, what I broke was what the rule that I broke and bent, that I flexed, kind of like the guy in the Matrix, I guess, is a rule. I've never understood that movie, by the way. I need somebody to break it down for me. But anyway, I guess the rule that I flexed is there's no such thing as limitations in God. A lot of times we put limitations around a limitless God, but there are no limitations when we know God. So that's it. That's a rule that I broke. I hope it's encouraging to somebody out there. Please feel free to share your questions, your stories, your thoughts, your opinions. I would love to hear them. This video is long enough, much longer than I meant it to be. So until the next time.